What could be more heartbreaking than witnessing your loved ones die one by one due to illness or accidents? But perhaps it is even more heart-wrenching and enraging when they are murdered for no apparent reason. The perpetrator uses such cunning tactics and hides so well. The pain is magnified when facing the fact that the murderer is still at large. In this context, the anger and desire for justice become the sole motivation for the victim's family to continue fighting. They not only seek answers, but also want the perpetrator to pay for their crimes, for justice to be served, and for the departed to rest in peace. Every clue, every piece of evidence, no matter how small, becomes a fragile hope in this arduous journey. However, the situation is not that simple. Today's case is the tragedy of a family where 3 people were murdered in one night, leaving a man to witness the loss of his wife and 2 young daughters in a state of fury. Was the perpetrator someone with a deep grudge against this family, or were they simply a thief? Some even believe the killer might be a psychopath who took the lives of a mother and her 2 children just to make a mark. The truth behind these deaths awaits your discovery. Welcome to Crime Documentary Files. On April 20th, 2006, a heartbreaking murder case occurred in Lingao County, Hainan Province, China. A mother and her 2 children died of asphyxiation. The incident was discovered by Zhang Zihan, 35, the husband and father of the victims, at 6 a.m. when he returned home after a night shift. Upon entering the house, Zhang Zihan sensed something was wrong. The house was eerily silent, with no sounds coming from the kitchen or living room. He called out to his wife and children but received no response. His heart raced, filled with a sense of dread. Zhang Zihan quickly ran to the bedroom. The scene that greeted him was shocking. His wife lay motionless on the bed, her face pale and lifeless. His 2 young daughters were also there, motionless and cold. Zhang Zihan felt his world collapse, unable to believe his eyes. He rushed to the bed, shaking his wife and children, trying to wake them, but all efforts were in vain. He called the police in a panic, his voice trembling and broken. Upon receiving Zhang Zihan's call, the police quickly arrived at the victim's house. The main bedroom where the crime occurred was filled with the smell of diethyl ether. Ether, used as an anesthetic, has a distinctive odor. This smell can linger on the victims' mouths and noses after exposure. It's easily recognizable, similar to the smell of alcohol or other volatile liquids. Sensitive individuals like the police can easily detect it. If the victims were anesthetized with ether, the smell would likely remain on their bodies, especially around the mouth and nose. On the bed, the wife's body lay with a swollen face. Bruises appeared, her lips turned dark purple, her eyes wide open, and dried blood marked her mouth and nose. Red marks on her neck suggested the murderer's hand or the edge of a pillow pressing against her face. Her hands were clenched, indicating a desperate struggle before losing consciousness. Beside the body, the pillow had bloodstains and clear handprints, indicating a fierce struggle. The strong smell of ether lingered in the air, hinting that the victim was anesthetized before being killed. The body lay in a rigid position, one arm twisted under her, showcasing her helplessness in the final moments. The pillow beside the wife's body had blood and handprints. The bloodstains weren't just on the surface, but soaked into the fabric, showing significant force was used. The pillow's edges had small tears and rough patches with indents, especially in the middle. Strands of the victim's hair were caught in the pillow. Police found small fabric fibers from the pillow on the victim's face and neck, indicating it was used to smother her. This pillow, an otherwise harmless household item, became a murder weapon in the hands of the killer. In the same room, the elder daughter's body lay on the floor, eyes wide open. Marks on her face and neck indicated a fierce struggle. Her body also showed bruises, signs of being restrained and killed. The younger daughter was found nearby. Her body lay curled up on the floor, surrounded by bloodstains and chaotic footprints. Bruises on her neck and face indicated she too was brutally killed. The autopsy results of all 3 victims showed that the cause of death was asphyxiation. On the wife's body, traces of ether were found around her nose and mouth, confirming that she was anesthetized before being killed. The older daughter had evidence of being smothered by hand, along with bruises and mechanical injuries around her neck. The youngest daughter's body showed similar injuries, with signs of asphyxiation and bruising, especially around her neck and face. Additionally, the pillow contained DNA from all three victims. The examination also revealed that all three were killed within a short time frame, indicating that the perpetrator acted decisively and gave the victims no chance to call for help or escape. Based on the evidence collected, it can be inferred that the killer approached the victims while they were in a deep sleep. He used a cloth soaked in ether to cover the victim's nose, causing her to temporarily lose consciousness. He then used a pillow to press down on her face, leading to asphyxiation. The pillow was pressed down with great force, as shown by the deep imprints and bloodstains soaked into the fabric. The handprints on the pillow indicated that the killer used both hands to apply pressure, ensuring the victim could not breathe. However, the perpetrator did not leave his own fingerprints on the pillow. Using a pillow allowed the killer to murder quickly and effectively, while also muffling the victim's cries for help, preventing nearby people from noticing. This was a calculated and ruthless act, showcasing the perpetrator's determination and cold-blooded nature. The use of ether for anesthesia also showed that the killer was well prepared. The murder of all three victims in a short time and in such a brutal manner suggests that the perpetrator not only had a strong motive, but also the ability to control the situation without succumbing to psychological pressure. The killer had a clear plan and acted decisively, leaving no chance for any victim to survive. The signs of violence and struggle on the victims' bodies, particularly the pillow marks and bruises, indicate that the victims fought back fiercely. The killer used physical strength to overpower them, suggesting he might have been physically superior or had an advantage over the victims. Police have also deduced that the killer likely had a familiar relationship with the family and may have been inside the house before, knowing the layout and the locations of each room and person. This familiarity helped him carry out the crime efficiently, without wasting time searching for the victims. The perpetrator could be someone known to the family, someone who had been in the house before and was aware of the family's routines. The first person on the scene was Zhang Zihan. He stated that the main door was open when he arrived home, but all locks and hinges were intact, indicating that the perpetrator did not force entry and might have been let in by the victims. The bedroom window, according to Zhang Zihan, was always left open at night for ventilation without much caution. This raised suspicions as the police found muddy footprints leading into the house around the window. However, these prints were only visible under a microscope, implying that the killer might have tried to erase them if he entered this way. Therefore, the killer could have entered through either the main door or the window, complicating the police's task of narrowing down suspects. The police first collected information about the three victims from the surviving family member, neighbors, and relatives. The first victim, Zhengming Yue, 33, was a primary school teacher. She was known as a gentle woman dedicated to her work and family. Her colleagues and students admired her for her kindness and enthusiasm. She was actively involved in volunteering and community activities, building a respected image as a mother and teacher. Zhengming Yue had good relationships with her colleagues and friends, showing no signs of serious conflicts. She also had a harmonious relationship with her husband, Zhang Zihan. Despite their busy work schedules, they always made time for family, sharing their daily lives and challenges. Neighbors often saw them taking short trips together to strengthen their bond and create beautiful memories with their children. The second victim was their eldest daughter, Zhang Jia'an, 12, a sixth grader. Zhang Jia'an was a smart, energetic girl with excellent academic performance. She participated in extracurricular activities like singing, dancing, and sports. At home, she was a model big sister, helping her parents care for and play with her younger sister. The youngest victim, Zhang Yekao, 8, was a second grader. According to Zhang Zihan, Zhang Yekao was a shy but adorable girl. She loved drawing and had a talent for art. She had won first place in several children's drawing competitions in the city. Zhang Yechao was always polite and obedient, respecting her elders. Despite her young age, she knew how to share and care for those around her. The initial reaction of the police to the case was one of sorrow and regret, as it seemed to be a perfect and happy family. Zhengming Yue, a kind and dedicated wife, was beloved and respected by her colleagues and students. Her two daughters, Zhang Jian and Zhang Yechao, were well-behaved, intelligent, and talented. The family's relationships appeared to be harmonious. Both the police and the surrounding community found it hard to imagine such a tragedy befalling a model family like this. There were no clear signs of internal conflict or any motive for such a crime within the family, posing a significant challenge to the investigation. The police suspected it might be a facade of a happy family they tried to maintain, but this possibility seemed low. This led the police to expand their investigation, considering every possibility from external relationships and hidden conflicts that the victims might have kept secret. Did anyone have a grudge against this family in the past or present? To clarify this, the police needed to investigate all relationships and activities of the victims, not only within the family, but also in their work environment and social activities. The police ruled out robbery as a motive, as Zhang Zihan confirmed that all valuable items and money in the house remained untouched. Therefore, the police focused on the relationships and conflicts involving the victims and the family with those around them, along with the suspicion that the perpetrator might be someone familiar with the family. On April 21st, the police compiled a list of suspects. The prime suspect was Mr. Li, 35. He was a close friend of Zhang Zihan and frequently visited the Zhang household. He had witnessed many arguments between Zhang Zihan and his wife. Moreover, Mr. Li often sided with Zhang Zihan. Notably, Mr. Li had a close relationship with Zheng Mingyue before she met Zhang Zihan, raising suspicions about the real dynamics among the three. Additionally, Mr. Li had a history of domestic violence and had been sued by his wife's family. In 2003, Zhang Zihan did not install cameras, but there was street surveillance that could show who entered and exited the Zhang house. The police requested footage and found that at 9 p.m. on April 20th, a man with a build similar to Mr. Li was seen loitering outside Zhang Zihan's house. Additionally, a hair sample found at the crime scene matched Mr. Li's DNA, despite his denial of being at the Zhang house on the night of the murder. Initially, the evidence pointed to Mr. Li's involvement. However, during interrogation, he continually asserted his innocence. Mr. Li claimed that on the night of the murder, he was at home and did not leave all evening, with his wife as his alibi. He insisted he had no reason to harm his friend's family, and that the arguments between Zhang Zihan and his wife were minor and not worth resorting to violence. He explained that his hair was at the scene because he often visited Zhang Zihan's house, and it could have fallen during previous visits. Regarding the surveillance footage, Mr. Li asserted that it was not him, possibly a mistake or someone with a similar build. He emphasized that despite his past with domestic violence over 3 years ago, he had made efforts to change and live a normal, non-violent life. Upon closer examination of the surveillance footage, the police realized that the man was not Mr. Li but a neighbor with a similar build. This neighbor confirmed that he often walked around the neighborhood at night due to insomnia, a fact well known among the local residents. The hair sample initially matched with Mr. Li's DNA was re-examined. Upon closer inspection, the police discovered that the hair was not new, but likely shed during Mr. Li's previous visits to the house, making its presence at the scene unsurprising. With this information, the police concluded that Mr. Li was innocent, and the initial evidence was either coincidental or an attempt by someone to frame him. However, during Mr. Li's interrogation, the police learned about another potential suspect, Mrs. Wang, 40, a neighbor who had personal conflicts with Zheng Mingyue over land disputes. Mrs. Wang was the only one who reported seeing a strange man entering and leaving the Zhang house on the night of the murder. However, her statement had several inconsistencies. The police also found incriminating evidence against Mrs. Wang. A piece of the ether-soaked cloth was discovered in her trash, and blood from one of the children was found on her window. When questioned, Mrs. Wang couldn't explain how these items ended up there. She had a history of mental illness and had previously exhibited violent behavior. To uncover the truth, the police decided to interrogate Mrs. Wang more thoroughly. During the interrogation, Mrs. Wang appeared confused and couldn't provide a coherent explanation for the evidence. She admitted to having personal conflicts with Jung Ming-yue over land, but insisted this was not a motive for her to act violently. An important detail uncovered was Mrs. Wang's treatment for mental illness at a local hospital. Her medical records indicated she had paranoid tendencies and might imagine scenarios that didn't exist. Doctors explained this could account for her inconsistent statements about seeing a strange man at the Jiang house. However, the ether-soaked cloth and blood on her window were undeniable pieces of evidence. Despite her mental instability, these findings seemed to implicate her. The police suspected that her illness might have led to uncontrolled actions. However, some officers believed the real culprit might be using her mental state and history to set her up. Ultimately, the police couldn't conclusively determine Mrs. Wang's guilt due to conflicting opinions. They continued to investigate other suspects and search for new leads to identify the true perpetrator or find more concrete evidence against Mrs. Wang. Meanwhile, they placed Mrs. Wang under special surveillance to ensure she didn't pose further danger and provided her with psychological support as needed. The final suspect on the list was the Zhang family's former housekeeper, Mrs. Liu, 35. She had worked for the Zhang family and was trusted by them. However, she was abruptly fired for unclear reasons. Rumors quickly spread that she had a romantic relationship with Zhang Zihan, leading to her dismissal by Jung Ming-yue. Mrs. Liu expressed anger and a sense of injustice to her friends after being fired. She felt wronged and didn't deserve such treatment. The conflict didn't end with her dismissal. Mrs. Liu felt humiliated by gossip and judgment from neighbors. Moreover, her animosity towards Jung Ming-yue deepened when Jung refused to pay her remaining wages and bonuses. This financial strain forced Mrs. Liu to borrow money to meet daily needs, adding to her psychological and financial pressure, possibly leading to negative behavior and thoughts. Although these conflicts didn't seem severe enough to drive someone to murder, an old phone belonging to Mrs. Liu was found at the scene. It contained numerous threatening messages from Zhang Zihan's wife. Additionally, the police discovered an unexplained deposit in Mrs. Liu's bank account shortly after the murder. However, thorough investigation revealed her innocence. The old phone with threatening messages found near the scene had been stolen from Mrs. Liu weeks earlier, which she didn't report, considering it a minor loss. This was confirmed when police matched the phone's disappearance with the timing of the threatening messages, indicating someone else used her phone to send them. After thoroughly examining the network records, the police discovered that the threatening messages sent to Jung Ming-yue were sent from various locations that did not match Mrs. Liu's whereabouts at those times. Mrs. Liu also provided evidence showing she was at different places when the messages were sent, including receipts and witness statements confirming her presence at locations far from the Zhang household. Furthermore, when comparing the timeline of the phone's loss with the messages, the police realized that the first threatening messages only appeared after Mrs. Liu had informed friends and family about losing her phone. The large, unusual sum of money in Mrs. Liu's bank account was also investigated. The police found that this money came from a bank loan Mrs. Liu had applied for before the murder to cover living expenses and debt. The related documents, including the loan agreement and payment receipts, were verified by the bank, ruling out any connection to the murder. After analyzing all the evidence, the police concluded that Mrs. Liu had neither the motive nor the opportunity to commit the crime. While there were conflicts between her and the Zhang family, they were not enough to make her a ruthless murderer. The truth about the threatening messages on Mrs. Liu's phone partially proved her innocence and indicated that the real culprit was still at large. The perpetrator might have been using Mrs. Liu and Mrs. Wang as scapegoats. After being exonerated, Mrs. Liu agreed to cooperate with the police and provided detailed testimony about what she knew. In her statement, Mrs. Liu recounted suspicious events involving Zhang Zihan, who the police had initially ruled out because he had an alibi, confirmed by co-workers that he was at work the night of the murders and returned home in the morning. Mrs. Liu recalled witnessing several intense arguments between Zhang Zihan and his wife before she was fired. Their relationship was complicated. While they appeared harmonious outwardly, those close to them knew there were underlying tensions. Zhang Zihan was a quiet, reserved man who was often absent due to work. However, during his rare moments at home, he often argued with Jung Ming-yue about parenting and important family decisions. Despite this, Zheng Mingyue tried to maintain stability and harmony in the family for the sake of their daughters, who often witnessed their parents' arguments. On the surface, the Zhang family seemed normal and happy. However, deeper investigation revealed unusual signs in their relationships. This information became crucial in the police's effort to uncover the truth behind Zheng Mingyue and her daughter's deaths. They began to delve deeper into Zhang Zihan and his recent activities. A significant event occurred the day before the murders. Zhang Zihan's co-worker, Mrs. Mu, happened to see him near Mrs. Lu's neighborhood. Her house was on a route she frequently traveled, so she noticed him but didn't find it suspicious at the time. Only after hearing about the police investigating Mrs. Lu did Mrs. Mu remember the sighting, hoping it might aid the case. The police scrutinized security cameras around Mrs. Lu's neighborhood and found footage of Zhang Zihan lingering near her house on the night she reported her phone missing. This raised strong suspicion that Zhang Zihan might have stolen Mrs. Lu's phone to execute his plan. Continuing the investigation, the police collected network records showing that the threatening messages to Zheng Mingyue were sent from locations near Zhang Zihan's workplace, further implicating him as the one using Mrs. Lu's phone. On April 25th, Zhang Zihan was summoned to the police station to confront the new evidence. During interrogation, he vehemently denied all accusations, maintaining his innocence and claiming no involvement in the murders. He explained his presence near Mrs. Lu's house as a coincidence, citing a personal errand in the area unrelated to stealing her phone or sending threatening messages. However, when presented with network records showing the messages were sent from near his workplace, Zhang Zihan had no plausible defense. Additionally, police had investigated his alibi, discovering that his co-worker, who confirmed his presence at the company the night of the murders, had been bribed to provide false testimony. In reality, Zhang Zihan left the company around 10 p.m. and returned around 4 a.m. Finally, after cross-referencing all evidence and gathered information, the police concluded that Zhang Zihan orchestrated the entire crime. He meticulously planned the murders, created a false alibi, and framed Mrs. Lu by stealing her phone to send threatening messages to Zheng Mingyue, deceiving the police. At the police station, Zhang Zihan confessed the whole truth. To live openly with his mistress, this unfaithful husband ruthlessly murdered his wife and 2 daughters. The motive for the crime stemmed from his extramarital relationship with a woman named Sue, 29. About 3 years before the crime, Zhang Zihan and Mrs. Su were merely colleagues. However, over time, they became attracted to each other, and their relationship gradually developed into a romantic one. During this period, Zhang Zihan's relationship with Zheng Mingyue had significantly deteriorated. They constantly argued about financial issues, parenting, and other important family decisions. This discord left Zhang Zihan feeling exhausted and hopeless. This was one reason he turned to an affair, as Mrs. Su was an attractive, intelligent woman who knew how to make an impression. This drew in Zhang Zihan, who was feeling trapped and unhappy in his marriage. Their relationship deepened, and eventually, they had a child together. This made them realize they wanted to be together officially and legally. However, they understood that Zheng Mingyue and the 2 daughters were major obstacles to their plan. Divorce was not a viable option, as the couple owned considerable assets, including properties and savings accounts. Zhang Zihan realized that if they divorced, Zheng Mingyue would receive most of the assets according to the law. Therefore, Mrs. Su did not hesitate to encourage Zhang Zihan to murder Zheng Mingyue so they could be together without any hindrance. About 3 months before the murder, after multiple discussions and planning, Zhang Zihan and Mrs. Su decided to execute a brutal plan to eliminate Zheng Mingyue. They considered various methods and finally chose to stage the murder to look like it was committed by someone else, specifically targeting Mrs. Wang and Mrs. Lu, who had previous conflicts with Zheng Mingyue, to mislead the police investigation. Zhang Zihan and Mrs. Su planned meticulously and in detail. They decided on a night when Zhang Zihan could create an alibi by staying late at work and returning home early in the morning with colleagues as witnesses. During this time, Zhang Zihan would sneak out and commit the crime. Before that, he thoroughly studied the area around his house, learning the routes and security weaknesses. He discovered that the entire area had only one camera that could see the front gate of his house, allowing him to enter the house through another route to avoid the camera. Zhang Zihan purchased the necessary tools, such as ropes, gloves, and other equipment. As the police investigation confirmed, it was Zhang Zihan who snuck into Mrs. Liu's house when she was away and quickly stole her phone. He then sent threatening messages to Zheng Mingyue the day before the murder so that she would be caught off guard. On April 19, 2006, Zhang Zihan decided to carry out his heinous act. To execute the plan, he used a rope to climb into his house late at night when his wife and daughters were asleep. In the darkness, he quietly approached his wife's bedroom. Zhang Zihan had prepared an ether-soaked cloth, a strong anesthetic, to use on his wife. As he got close to the bed, Zhang Zihan carefully placed the ether-soaked cloth over his wife's nose and mouth, causing her to lose consciousness immediately. He then used a pillow to suffocate her until she died from asphyxiation. While doing this, his 12-year-old daughter woke up and saw the horrific scene. In a panic, Zhang Zihan turned his attention to her. He used the same method, applying the ether-soaked cloth to knock her unconscious before using the pillow to suffocate her. The cries and noises from the struggle woke up his 8-year-old daughter. She cried and panicked at what she saw. To silence her, Zhang Zihan killed her as well. He repeated the same cruel method, anesthetizing her with the ether-soaked cloth before suffocating her with the pillow. During the entire crime, Zhang Zihan called Mrs. Su to report what was happening, proving his commitment to their plan. Zhang Zihan's ruthless actions were driven not only by Mrs. Su's instigation, but also by his own greed and lack of conscience. After killing his wife and daughters, Zhang Zihan immediately executed the next part of his plan to mislead the police investigation and frame others. First, he took the ether-soaked cloth used to anesthetize Zheng Mingyue and his daughters and discarded it in Mrs. Wang's trash can. He believed this would make the police suspect Mrs. Wang's involvement in the crime. Next, Zhang Zihan carefully took a piece of cloth and soaked it in Zheng Mingyue's blood. He then went near Mrs. Wang's window and smeared the blood on it to further implicate her. Additionally, he brought along Mrs. Liu's stolen cell phone. He placed it near Mrs. Wang's house to create false evidence, making the police believe that Mrs. Liu and Mrs. Wang were closely connected to the crime. This was also to ensure both Mrs. Liu and Mrs. Wang became police suspects, allowing Zhang Zihan to escape suspicion. Zhang Zihan executed these actions meticulously, hoping the police would be deceived by the fabricated evidence and not investigate him. However, his efforts ultimately failed, as the police persistently investigated and found inconsistencies in the evidence and testimonies, leading to Zhang Zihan's arrest and confession. When interrogated by the police, Mrs. Su admitted that she was almost fully aware of the entire incident through phone calls. Mrs. Su testified that on the night of the murders, she received a call from Zhang Zihan. During the call, Zhang Zihan described in detail what he was doing, from climbing into the house with a rope to approaching his wife and 2 daughters. At that moment, Mrs. Su stated that she felt regretful and truly terrified. She tried to stop Zhang Zihan upon realizing he was about to kill Zheng Mingyue, but to no avail. She continuously pleaded with Zhang Zihan to stop, especially when he talked about killing the 2 children. However, her pleas could not change Zhang Zihan's mind. In a state of frenzy driven by greed and rage, Zhang Zihan proceeded with his heinous actions. He completely ignored Mrs. Su's begging and went on to murder his 2 daughters. Mrs. Su admitted that while she did not directly participate in the murders, she felt guilty for planning the murders with Zhang Zihan and regretted it only when it was too late. Her testimony helped the police better understand Zhang Zihan's motives and criminal process. The police realized that although Mrs. Su did not directly take part in the murders, she knew about the plan in advance and did not report it. Moreover, she had incited Zhang Zihan. This made her legally responsible as well. Her statements not only confirmed Zhang Zihan's crimes, but also shed light on the brutality and inhumanity of his actions in this horrific murder case. On May 1st, the Supreme Court sentenced Zhang Zihan to death on 3 counts of murder and Mrs. Su to 15 years in prison for being an accessory to murder. This gruesome murder case not only left an unending pain for the victim's loved ones, but also served as a stark reminder of the dangers of greed, selfishness, and irresponsibility within a family. This case shows that love and happiness in a family cannot be built on deceit and betrayal. Zhang Zihan's extramarital affair and immoral actions led to a heartbreaking tragedy, resulting in the loss of 3 innocent lives, including 2 young children. The lesson from this case highlights the importance of honesty and responsibility in family relationships. Each individual must be mindful of their actions, carefully consider their decisions, and cherish the happiness of their loved ones. Additionally, the case underscores the need for education and the installation of ethical values in younger generations, helping them understand the consequences of wrongful actions. Finally, we must raise awareness and maintain a determined stance against criminal acts to protect justice and bring peace to the community. Thank you for watching this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the Crime Documentary Files channel to learn more about real-life crime cases.